I rather feel that most of the things I've said you will have heard me say before, but I think there are a few things coming out. I think progress is being made, though I think it's now just over 2 years since the guilty verdicts in the HBOS case, and things have really moved very glacially slowly. What I find, we've got two ministers really directly involved, John Glenn from the Treasury and Ben Wallace from the Home Office. I find it very difficult really dealing with John Glenn because I get very nice letters back from him when I write, and they're clearly written by the civil servants and they clearly don't answer my questions. It's interesting, I went on to him about the Griggs review the other day, and he says that all those cases referred by the convicted former HBOS employees to Quayside Corporate Services are being looked at. That is not my view at all. I think a lot of cases that went through Quayside Corporate Services, of course, didn't come up in the trial because we only trialled a very small proportion of it. And if they didn't come up in the trial, they're being totally ignored as far as I can see. Customer cases involved were managed by Quayside, and all previous any new customer complaints regarding the convicted former HBOS employees and or Quayside. The trouble is, a lot of the cases were not actually dealt with directly by Lyndon Scurfield. They were directed by his number 2 or his number 3 or his staff. And they absolutely refused to take on those cases, and I've seen any number of those. So I think the Minister has been led right up the garden path on that one. And he also goes on about my questions on subject of the Turnbull report and saying they didn't investigate the Turnbull report because the police were investigating it. Once the police investigation had ended, they started again to investigate it. It is 2 years since the guilty verdicts, and in 2 years they have done absolutely precisely nothing about it. It does not require 2 years, it requires, on the whole, about an hour and a half to work this one out. What is absolutely clear is the Turnbull report was concealed from the chairman of Lloyd's, Lord Blackwell, and from the non-executive board of Lloyd's for 3 years, from the time it was handed in 2014 to when I gave a copy to Lord Blackwell of the Turnbull report, which he had not seen. The excuse given by the executive directors of Lloyd's, of whom there are 3, is that we gave it to the PRA, which is the Bank of England, and the Financial Conduct Authority. What they don't point out is it was accompanied by a letter saying this is totally unsubstantiated, it's totally rubbish, the lady who wrote it is out of control and it wasn't commissioned, so disregarded, in effect. Well, they came unstuck on that one when they eventually, last year, had to end up paying Sally Masterton quite a large sum of money for, quite honestly, just lying about her report consistently by then for very nearly 5 years. I sometimes wonder when I read letters from John Glenn whether he actually understands it, but they're just being written by his civil servants, and I don't think he's got a grip of it at all. Ben Wallace, I have far more confidence in. His heart's in the right place on this one. I think he has a problem in that the Home Office are not terribly interested in this case and would rather it didn't come across their floor in the first place. I gave it to the Home Office, the Turnbull report, again 2 years ago, and they've done absolutely nothing with it. But Ben Wallace did actually have the grace to say in public the other day, well, it wasn't in public, but it was to all the PCCs when I was there, that the report, Turnbull and the entire HBOS case should have been investigated by the Serious Fraud Office. And the fact that they refused to take it on, I still find is extraordinary. And on that subject, I still find it absolutely extraordinary, and I've just written to the director of the Serious Fraud Office, that here the Serious Fraud Office is spending a huge amount of time and money taking Barclays directors through the court system. And I'm sure probably what Barclays did was not absolutely legal, and it was a bit dodgy, getting money for Qatar to keep the bank going. But they've absolutely refused to take on Lloyd's and the Royal Bank of Scotland, who destroyed tens of thousands of companies illegally in large part, and then took colossal sums of money off the government. And there seems to be a protection racket that is covering up and will not investigate what either of them did. But I think it's very difficult to take on individual cases at a national level, and it doesn't really work. But I think the two holes that the banks have is one, the hiding of the Turnbull report from their chairman and non-executive directors. And Kevin Hollinrake asked twice in the House of Commons that the executive directors of Lloyd's should be forced to resign, and I absolutely agree with that. They should have been sacked, not asked to resign. In any other company, they would have been. And I think the other one that is causing Lloyd's considerable upset at the moment is the absolute refusal to believe, well, they know perfectly well, so they do believe, that anything went wrong out of their recoveries division in Bristol. And the absolute refusal of Avon and Somerset Police to investigate that in any way whatsoever. And when I'm told that they've investigated these cases, and I ring up somebody, and they've never even bothered to go and see that person, I find that whole business utterly extraordinary. And I hope that that will come to justice, and there will be a proper investigation into what went on both in the police and in Acorn Finance, Alder King and Burgess Salmon. It's high time that happened. It's quite interesting, the BBC, when I think it was Points West, did a programme on it about 3 or 4 months ago. When Lloyd's found they were doing it, they threw every single bit of their high-powered lawyers at the senior management of the BBC in London to stop that programme going out. This is a small, West Country programme, and they moved heaven and earth to stop it. They did actually stop about half of it. I think the BBC is sufficiently annoyed about that they gave the police and crime panel the other day a good coverage when a lot of people went along and made a fuss about what had gone on. So I think that one is slowly coming home to roost. The Dame Linda Dobbs inquiry. This has been used as the most convenient way to shuffle anything the FCA and the PRA don't want to do. And they say, oh, it's all right, it's been looked at by Dame Linda Dobbs. Well, it may be independent, allegedly, but it's paid for by Lloyd's and it reports to Lloyd's. And it has not produced an interim report, which it clearly should have done. It's interesting that the big review of banks that went on in Australia, that produced fairly quickly an interim report on which people were able to act. Dame Linda Dobbs will be, it was originally meant to be about a 6-month investigation. It will be, when will it? They're saying it'll come out at the end of this year, but I'm not holding my breath on that. So that will be 3 years after the guilty verdicts, during which time, of course, the people who were taken to pieces by it have lived, a lot of them, in penury. And the number of people I've had telephone calls who have been dispossessed of their houses is extraordinary, and I've made that point fairly clear to the ministers. It's quite interesting how the press play this one. I feel we have our friends and supporters and some who avoid it like the plague. I think the Financial Times has done a great job trying to chase this up. Jonathan Ford. You probably saw the Evening Standard article, some of you, that came out last Friday. I was surprised Osborne clearly wasn't on the ball and didn't notice it sliding through, because I think he'd have probably stopped it, but maybe I'm wrong on that one. I think the Times, James Hurley has done quite a good job trying to do this. The Daily Mail's carried a bit. The Telegraph has avoided it like the plague, and I never quite know why. I've never looked at the banking arrangements of the Barclay brothers who own it. The Guardian is beginning to take a considerable interest in it now. And I think the BBC are at last waking up to the fact that Lloyd's are not going to prosecute them, or Lloyd's or RBS. They would hate to take this to a court over a single case. There is one gentleman, and I don't think he's here today, who writes the most vitriolic letters about the boards of Lloyd's Bank, naming them one by one and saying they're the worst crooks in the country and one thing or another. And as some professor wrote in quite dryly, he said, I wonder why they don't prosecute you. And the answer, of course, they would hate to bring it up in court, because most of what he says is true. But we'll wait for that one. And of course, the other thing the banks hold over the newspapers is advertising. and they do rely a great deal, if you look at the size of the Lloyd's advertisements, you know, advising, what is the Lloyd's advertisement for small companies? We're beside you or something. By your side, well, at your back or throat should be more appropriate, I think. I have laid out quite clearly in 2 speeches a number of measures that have to be taken to stop this, and also to set up a proper tribunal system to recompense people. I hope those will go through. I'm fortunate in my job. I've got about a year and a quarter to go. I'm a fairly loose cannon. I have got a meeting with the Prime Minister coming up. The last 2 were cancelled. I told my staff not to bother again, and I was rather surprised to find that her staff had rung up and she's coming to see me. So I will give her a folder on the subject, amongst others. Whether it'll do any good, I'm not sure. But I think it will, because, of course, I did take this to her nearly 2 years ago, and I did give the number 10 the Turnbull report at that time. And this is the one, I think I've said it before, that went directly to the Cabinet Secretary, Jeremy Hayward, who invited me to talk it over, and then when he did a bit of digging, rapidly uninvited me. So the meeting never took place. So at the end of that, I think progress is being made. I just regret it's not being made a little bit faster than it is, but various things are clicking into space. So I'm reasonably optimistic we will sort this out.